Between 1965 and 1969, a highly specific demographic cohort was born in the United States, the early Black Generation X. This chart shows the percentage of Black men born in those years who served in prison, compared to those who completed college or military service. By their early 30s, the men in this cohort were more likely to go to prison than to earn a degree or complete a military tour. Looking closely, 22.4%, nearly a quarter of this demographic slice, had served a prison term by 1999. This reality sits in stark contrast to the era they were born into. As children of the mid-1960s, they were the first generation to come of age after the 1964 Civil Rights Act legally dismantled segregation. They were expected to inherit an equal society. Instead of a unified climb toward prosperity, the decades that followed split this generation down the middle, creating two completely divergent, deeply opposed realities. The ink on the new civil rights legislation cleared the way for massive upward mobility for millions of individuals, while a highly calculated, punitive political backlash prepared to catch the rest. Let's follow the first path. The enforcement of anti-discrimination laws and the rollout of affirmative action programs systematically removed the legal barriers that had long kept Black Americans out of elite universities and the corporate labor market. This chart tracks college attendance rates by race and sex. If you look at the lines for Black males and Black females starting in the 1970s, you see a sharp upward curve. Attendance rates for Black men, for example, jumped from roughly 16% in 1971 to nearly 50% by the early 2000s. The data isn't perfectly clean. Dropout rates did creep up slightly during this period, but the sheer volume of new students remaining in the system resulted in an enormous wave of graduates entering the workforce. That influx translated directly into professional gains. Between 1970 and 1990, the number of Black physicians tripled, engineers almost quadrupled, and attorneys multiplied by 6. All of these individual careers pooled together to build a surging Black middle class. By the end of the century, almost a third of the Black population lived in the suburbs, and 42% owned their own homes. For the individuals in this cohort who could navigate their way into and through higher education, the civil rights victories of the 1960s successfully delivered systemic prosperity. But there is a second path. For the segment of this cohort unable to access a college degree, the urban environment they inherited was rapidly deteriorating. In the 1970s, a severe national recession collided with a rapid wave of deindustrialization across the country. Manufacturing plants began closing their doors, moving overseas or out to the suburbs. The disappearance of these blue-collar jobs pushed employment opportunities for low-skilled Black men in cities to the vanishing point. In some formerly industrial urban cores, employment declined so sharply that only a third of residents held a job. With few municipal services and legitimate paychecks drying up, the quality of life in these neighborhoods plummeted. Illicit drug markets quickly took hold, stepping in to fill the massive economic void left behind by the factories. The young men in these neighborhoods found themselves caught in a vice, locked out of the educational boom on one side and crushed by total macroeconomic collapse on the other. Instead of treating this urban economic collapse as a structural crisis requiring aid, politicians saw an electoral opportunity. They began weaponizing the visible poverty and rising crime rates to build a highly successful political narrative. The foundation for this was laid early. During the 1964 presidential election, Republican challenger Barry Goldwater campaigned on a platform that explicitly connected civil rights activism with street crime. Richard Nixon then adopted this framework, using an aggressive law and order rhetoric with heavy racial undertones to build what became known as the Southern Strategy during his presidential campaigns. That rhetoric quickly became law. Policymakers on both sides of the aisle rolled out the war on crime, enacting a spate of harsh mandatory minimum sentencing policies that demanded extreme punishment for offenses. On the ground, this meant deploying militarized policing practices to target these specific neighborhoods. Larger and larger numbers of unemployed Black urban residents with low levels of education were swept directly off the streets and into the penal system. Confronted with the devastating fallout of urban deindustrialization, the government chose to manage the crisis with a targeted carceral net rather than economic investment. By the 1990s, the demographic composition of the American prison system had completely flipped. The mid-century majority white prison population was replaced by a majority black population. For an entire sector of early Black Gen X, the standard transition to adulthood, moving from school to work to marriage to buying a home, was hijacked, replaced by a cycle of surveillance, arrest, and incarceration. The legislative victories of the 1960s successfully shattered glass ceilings for the educated, allowing a robust middle class to rise. But those same laws failed to protect marginalized communities from the machinery of the modern carceral state. To learn more about the complicated history of American social policy and its lasting impacts, subscribe to the Black Evidence Project.